joining us with his take on U.S.-Libyan relations and really how this uprising can affect the balance of powers. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President George W. Bush, retired General Richard Myers. Good morning to you, sir. Welcome to In Business. Tell me, with Egypt, there was a lot of confidence built around the fact that the U.S. had military ties to the Egyptian military, some faith that order could be restored. Is there any kind of backbone like that in Libya?
Margaret, I don't think there's any backbone like that. We were fortunate, I think, in Egypt that U.S. military had great relations with the Egyptian military. The Egyptian military both trained and were educated in the United States. Lots of contact. I think when I was chairman, I made several trips to Egypt, met with senior military leadership as well as the president and those sorts of people. So you can keep those ties alive, but we don't have that. And we haven't had that, I think, from the late 60s when Gaddafi took over. We haven't had those kind of relations in Libya for a long time.
But relations with Libya did change under the Bush administration. Libya agreed to give up their weapons of mass destruction, also took some ownership of the Lockerbie bombing there. Was it wrong to reestablish ties with Libya given the kind of brutality that Muammar Gaddafi is carrying out against his people?
Well, I think at the time, you have to weigh what you think is going to benefit the most people. To have Libya not involved in weapons of mass destruction, they were building cascades to develop enriched uranium that could possibly go in a weapon. They gave all that up. They gave their other weapons of mass destruction projects up, and of course stopped supporting terrorism on a international scale. Those were big gives by the Libyan leadership, by Gaddafi in 2003. So I think we were better off because of that. Clearly, what we've seen here in the last day or two with the Libyan military attacking its own people is despicable and certainly not. No, I don't think anybody would think that's appropriate, other than, of course, the leadership in Libya.
But at the time when we were reestablishing, any kind of relationship with Libya, did you ever, what's the Libya that you envisioned under Gaddafi's continued leadership there? I mean, was the bet that his son would take over? Was the bet that he was a safer alternative than some sort of public protest that would lead to a democratic government?
I don't think anybody had any illusions about the Libya after 2003, or that we would have much leverage, we being the United States, or for that matter the international community, would have much leverage over Libya in which direction they went. I think we were relieved that they weren't pursuing nuclear weapons and that they weren't pursuing international terrorism, which they had supported in the past vis-a-vis the Lockerbie bombing and so forth. So I don't know that we thought we had enough leverage to change it, but thought it would change over time. After all, Colonel Gaddafi is getting up there in years, and at some point that's all going to have to give. But I think what we're seeing is, like a lot of that part of the world, there's this huge youth population that is not well educated and doesn't see economic opportunity just around the corner, and are dissatisfied that there are those that are the haves and a lot that are have-nots.
Right, and with that in mind, there are a lot of people looking back saying, and re-examining the Bush doctrines and the decision to go into Iraq with the context of something that we hadn't bet on, which was democracy, or, movements towards democracy would bubble up of their own volition in the streets of some of these countries, including Libya. Is that something that you ever factored in?
I don't think the military ever factored that in. I think there were others in the administration, the Bush administration, that thought, if Iraq can turn to a more democratic regime, that it might have an effect throughout the region. And there were those that thought that. I think the military was not thinking so much along those lines. We had this huge task to try to work the issues in Iraq and Afghanistan that we were asked to work. And probably there were a lot that were quite skeptical. So you don't know all the causal effects. I think this huge youth population. I think the military did think, or we did think, that in a country like Iran, that it would be the youth, the huge youth bulge, that would eventually say they're tired of the theocracy and perhaps overturn it. And you've seen some of that, although brutally put down by the regime in Iran.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you, what would you be advising now? There are some who have called for a no-fly zone to be instituted over Libya to prevent Gaddafi from flying in mercenaries from elsewhere in Africa. He's been accused of doing so. What should the U.S. be doing, encouraging?
Well, again, I think it's one of these situations where our ambassador left some time ago, so we don't have an ambassador there. So relations with the regime in Libya is not very strong at this point. So I don't think we have a lot of leverage, and I think we have to obviously be very careful. I'd leave it to the folks in the Pentagon to come up with options for President Obama on some things we could do. Clearly, there are some things that can be done, but I'd leave it to them, not try to get ahead of them in terms of options.
All right, General, thank you for joining us.